What does debt do to the household economy? So as the context here is the kind of Anglo-American economies are now approaching a decade since the 2008 financial crisis. And the household debt overhang cultivated during the boom years remains a persistent drag on economic renewal. The current kind of fragile recovery, although if you were listening to the budget speech yesterday, it was all very Orwellian and triumphant in its kind of argument that we're mending the roof while the sun is shining. The sun is shining being some sort of very bad metaphor for the state of the UK economy, or inaccurate anyway. But with inflation negative in both the US and the UK, we are on the precipice of a great economic unknown of debt deflation, or a debt deflationary spiral. Still, policymakers are committed to finance-led growth model where credit creation fuels asset bubbles in order to drive whatever measures of economic activity are sort of cherry-picked at various points to kind of triumphantly declare that the sun is shining on the economy. But a growing volume of research recognizes the pivotal role that the household sector, and more specifically household debt levels, play in shaping these wider macroeconomic trends. But on the one hand, where we can see intensifying income and wealth inequalities that are clearly linked to finance-led growth, increasingly the inequality that's linked to indebtedness and what indebtedness is doing to the wider economy remains elusive. So I just want to, giving the two presentations that came before, I just wanted to kind of quickly foreground what would be a kind of what you need to know to understand why what I'm saying is slightly different. And I don't disagree with the accounts of kind of shadow banking and so on. It's more that it would be important to highlight at this stage kind of what's a little bit different about what I'm trying to say. And it really starts basically the story, and I concur with what you said about to talk about this as kind of financial deregulation, as kind of decoupling, that these are boring terms that don't really describe anything. And don't really accurately capture the kind of scale of socioeconomic change that has underwent. So first thing that you need to understand to know to understand my point of view on this is that I'm starting from the position of how is debt made. Okay, so debt is just numbers. Okay, it's really just numbers. Excel has a lot to answer for in the great march of financialization, but basically, I'm just going to go straight out of the Bank of England here to say that, basically banks create debt accounts through legal kind of credit contracts. In the modern economy, most money takes the form of bank deposits. But how those bank deposits are created is again not well understood. I'm quoting the Bank of England here. The principal way is through commercial banks making loans. Whether a bank makes a loan, when a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. So this is the kind of standard, everybody's heard of positive money. The new campaign that's kind of about making this a public issue. But again, the principle was well-founded from about 10 years ago. It became somewhat common knowledge that there is no more loanable funds model of banking. We all say, it's all disintermediated banking, but we don't really take that to heart in our kind of analysis of debt and what debt does. We still want to assume that there is some sort of coherence to a system in which effectively money is made from nothing. And it's housed on vast server farms. There is no reserve ratios are mutable, changing based on risk profiles. The definition is always changing in order to kind of bring coherence to what is effectively the private creation of money through debt contracts. So in practice, this means that the debt numbers are created, they're logged on vast electronic servers, they are made coherent through the processes of balance sheets and double entry bookkeeping. This is the mechanism that allows these numbers to be made into material reality, but that is actually kind of formally done. A debt becomes an asset on a bank's balance sheet when the contract is signed. When it's actually the legal underwriting, it's the vast amounts of paper. So if we look at a standard OTC contract for a CDO, how many pages?
No.
Oh, you don't? Download one. With all credit enhancements, you'd be looking about 1,200 pages for one OTC backup in order to get the paperwork in order. So it's those 1,200 pages that make the CDO something real. So there is a real backing to all of this, and that is a kind of legal contracts. And these legal contracts are basically, these loan contracts are the feedstock to this vast shadow banking system. But money creation by banks is the wellspring, right? So if this is how debt is made in the big picture, how is debt made at the household level? Okay, which is where I'm getting to with all this. Because we know that what makes banking unique in the modern context is that effectively banks can create money from nothing, from the basic electronic money creation. So we know that this is a significant structural power that banks have, but it doesn't become an asset until the loan contract is signed. And again, this is why banks are so concerned. The only risk associated with this asset then becomes the risk of non-payment or default, right? So when you can make an asset from nothing, right, there still has to be some element, and the only element is this risk associated with non-payment. So it's important to understand that that is actually quite a strong position of structural power that the banks have. Now, what does this mean for something like central banking? Well, we know that central banks just simply absorb these debt numbers that are created, right? Their balance sheet just expands to kind of absorb it. But then we see the effects, which is the kind of conundrum that we're in now, which is the balance sheet recession. So this is the kind of new, rather euphemistic term they have that tries to just, kind of make sense of the economic state that we're in right now and say, well, effectively, this is about the credit cycle, not the business cycle. So again, they're trying to really make a lot out of the bifurcation of the real economy from the financialized economy to say, well, a real economy has a production cycle model of recession, but a financialized economy has a credit cycle kind of model of recession. So, and again, there's a Kuh's book on this is, kind of tells you chapter and verse, the kind of logic around this kind of balance sheet recession. And then you have the kind of Krugman argument around what the effects of this is, well, is that we have simultaneous deleveraging happening in which the stock of debt has gotten so big that the pay down of debt is dragging the economy, but at the same time what we need for economic renewal is more borrowing. So we get stuck in this trap. We're trying to deal with the debt overhang, but in order to generate economic activity, we require more debt issuance. Where is the limit here? When does the kind of laws of gravity begin to apply? Is kind of what we're always chasing the curve, right? What's that moment until we hit diminishing returns? The balance sheet recession is trying to understand how all these mechanisms work. But as compelling as a story as that is, I think it leaves a lot to be desired. Inasmuch as that it still never fundamentally kind of opens the black box of the household. Because we see the effects of the household, right? So the problem of the household sector is that we have a problem of aggregation. So if you come from a kind of rational, either behaviorist or kind of standard homo economicus position, the household is a problem in that we can understand rational preferences and rational choices and behavioral traits and behavioral conditions at the individual level. But the household is something more complex than that, so we can just aggregate up. But we know that that's sociologically without fact or reason, that doesn't actually happen, and therefore is necessitated to be kind of assumed away. The problem we have with the kind of macroeconomic frame is the kind of functional equivalent problem, in which the household sector is simply the pass-through mechanism for all kind of produced and consumed goods and services in an economy. It's not unpacked in any way. This is quite a standard. Again, you just need to go back to the sort of 1960s and 70s and feminist political economists' critiques of national accounts measures to see that the same problem still exists. The household is a black box. That is why we can only see the effects of what debt is doing to the household. We cannot actually analyze them, understand them, and or act upon them, because we are only ever allowing ourselves to see whatever's happening in there. We're only ever on the back foot trying to understand the effects of it. So if we actually take for a moment, so I thought it was actually kind of interesting, again, to tie into the presentation, earlier was that when you talked about the high net individuals, high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals, you say these are, a group of families. Like we understand at the ultra high net worth individual, the family houses, the wealth, holding companies, we can understand that actually at the very, very elite level, what actually, where this wealth is held and how it's administered has a lot more to do with household dynamics than it does with sort of rational acting agents. And there's lots of kind of evidence to back this up that this is family money, right? And family money is not managed in a search for yield. They have to kind of give that to asset managers. And we all, we're all part of families, so I think you can imagine how much more complex your own family drama would be if you were sort of also trying to manage 200 billion euros, right? I mean, it would start getting ugly. But we cannot. I mean, there's been a lot of research to back up how the very, very wealthy, high net individuals kind of manage household finances in a way that actually has real effects on the economy. You only have to look at the Porsche buyout or failed buyout to kind of know that these things matter, or Compact and HP. But these are kind of anecdotal evidence, but there's kind of lots of sociological, anthropological evidence to back this up. So we can recognize it at the very, very highest levels of wealth, but we still have this fundamental roadblock around the household as a sector, right? As a kind of unit and an object of analysis. So what does it mean to kind of look at household debt and what it does? Well, first we have to begin to look at the household level and what's happening. So because this will allow us to conceptualize financialization as a social process, as something that is actually inherent to human organization, not something that is necessarily imposed from some outer logic. And it also allows us to do away with the problem that kind of Jan hinted at before about, well, we're just assuming rational preferences here, we're assuming it's the search for yield. When you begin with the kind of household frame, you don't have to assume profit maximization. Again, that would be the inherent problem of aggregation. We can assume at the household level, and looking at financialization from this, that it doesn't have to be coherent. Okay. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, I mean, again, I can go into more detail of the kind of methodological questions around how we actually observe these things, but basically, part of the problem that becomes evident when we look at households is the way in which the balance sheet and the assumption of equilibrium becomes highly problematic. So the balance sheet, again, is a conceptual framework. It's not an empirical framework. It's a conceptual framework. It's a way of categorizing, sorting, and making sense of these numbers, right, that are meant to represent different kind of financial instruments and transactions. And obviously the budget sheet, or sorry, the balance sheet becomes a problem for the household in as much as that it obscures what's actually happening. So when you have a credit-fueled asset bubble, the balance sheet allows for the rapid rise in the value of your house to obscure your kind of daily cost of living crunch that is actually forcing you to acquire more debts. So the kind of rapidly inflating asset bubble kind of masks, again with a problem of functional equivalence, the deep levels of inequality between households, but also it masks the really important relationship between debt and income, and ultimately what gets us to the current balance sheet recession. But again, making a link to the previous presentation and kind of more the crowd that's here and what you guys are kind of interested in, is that if we bring back the household kind of perspective on debt and we link that directly to our understanding of electronic money creation by banks, we can actually follow the money. This is quite an interesting activity. We can follow the loan contracts. If we understand that what makes the wellspring of the shadow banking system is exactly plain vanilla securitization of very standard loan contracts, then it would be interesting to kind of unpack what is the very process that is making these loan contracts grow year on year, expand and proliferate. Again, we know this is happening, but we just don't actually follow how this works. So if household debt is the feedstock of the entire global financialized system, then I would make the case that this is precisely the reason why we need to understand what debt is doing to households. Because I believe ultimately this will be the trigger to a kind of broader collapse of the financialized system. So, yeah, these loan contracts become, the securitized assets that are then sliced and diced and so on. So it's important to also then, if we link back the kind of electronic money creation with what's happening to the households, we have to understand that the money creation by banks actually disrupts and subverts the balance sheet as a mechanism or device to kind of understand, or calculative technique by which to kind of view the household and what's happening. So, okay. All right, so instead I kind of have developed this methodological technique around examining what debt does to households by looking at their budget sheet. So I just have a kind of again, this is what it looks like when you actually try to analyze household surveys with it, but more commonly it looks like this. So this is a kind of example of what's called a common financial statement. This is kind of what debt advisors use debt advice. This is licensed by the Financial Conduct Authority as the main mechanism to generate figures on what the state of household finances. But interestingly, it also correlates quite closely with kind of basic Google templates, basic Excel templates, phone apps, household budgeting apps for tablets and phones. So this is on the rise. It's called Get Yourself a Budget. That's one of the biggest apps there is. But there's also Quicken. There's also My Money. There's Pocket, Wallet, everything. They use, interestingly enough, they use a budget sheet. They don't use a balance sheet framework. They're not asking you to amortize your assets. They're not asking you to even account for what your perceived value of your assets are. They intuitively derive the household's financial security based on a simple kind of way of measuring income. The most important figure for every household is what the income figure is. What is the amount of money that the household has every month to deal with? Next, then they'll have other earnings, other forms of earnings, any sorts of benefits. So this is all kind of on the income side. But for about 75% of households, this is the biggest and most significant figures. The rest are sort of irrelevant, unless they're pensioners, and then pension becomes the kind of... So an interesting link with Guy Standing and his idea around the salariat, the idea of like salaried workers as having a unique power position. You can see that in how they collect data on household financial security. They ask, is this a salaried position? So wages and salaries are actually marked in different categories around triggers. But then the next most important is expenditure, right? So how much is your outgoings? This is your cost of living crisis. How much is your living costs, your food, your bills, so on. And then it kind of goes like that. And then down here is all of your debts. Now we know what's happening to the household balance sheet is the number of debts, commitments is getting longer, but also the amount is getting bigger. And the important thing about the budget sheet is it allows you to account for stocks and flows side by side. Okay, so you can account for how much do you service your debts, how much did you pay your credit cards, how much is outstanding in your credit cards. These are measured side by side. In the traditional household survey, they only really measure flows as a general rule. So why does it matter, just to kind of sum up? Why do we need to do this? Why would I go to all the trouble to kind of develop this method, test it out, and so on? Well, basically because currently I feel there is a genuine lack of understanding of what debt is doing to the household economy. But using this method, I believe, kind of will allow me to see how the framework of kind of looking at income, at sources and claims on income, is actually a more accurate reflection of how debt drags the economy. Because what we realize is that when debt repayments become a significant and rising claim against income, we get in a situation in which we live in a present where the past is devouring our future. This is kind of Piketty's larger claim, looking at the big. But we could see this on the very small level in which the temporalities of debt obligations, the buy now, pay later kind of small statement that makes intuitive sense and seems rather simple actually becomes a very complex changing system that is not easily managed and is not well understood by given kind of conceptual frameworks. So when you are effectively taking present day income in order to pay for economic activity that's already been measured in the past because it was when you bought the car or when you paid for your university education or when you got that second mortgage to pay off your debts, and you're taking your present day wage income and paying your past debt obligations, the future of economic renewal is effectively destroyed because you will just work harder and harder to pay off the past. And we cannot... This ultimately, there will come some point in the present in which the past, you have a day of reckoning, the past catches up. But why do we need to know this? This guy, economist at the TUC said to me, it's all well and good, debts are rising, we all know households are in trouble, but why do we even need to know? I mean, it's just telling me the exact figure of how deep in shit we are at the moment. And what would be the point of that? Isn't, surely it is about doing something about it, right? And providing a way forward. But I think it's still important to understand that what this kind of mechanism will allow me to highlight. One is the inequalities around debt. So again, that the way in which indebtedness manifests as a kind of power relation is unequally distributed through society. This is about particular groups having a form of debt dependence that is ultimately really the driver and the bedrock. Let's just say it's the bedrock of the system. Importantly, it kind of reveals the temporalities, the shifting temporalities of financialization, which changes the very mechanisms or the kind of very frameworks by which we understand the mechanisms of the economy. And finally, the kind of cartographies of debt. That's one thing that is usually kind of really missing, is the way in which, again, if you are a property owner in London versus if you're a property owner in Durham, these have real effects. We know that, but yet we are still somehow resistant to actually talk about how inequality and power relations are as much spatially located as they are sort of located within a kind of systemic understanding of stratification, let's say, or inequality. So I think by looking at the household debt in more depth, we'll be able to kind of actually begin to picture the way out of the current mess that we're in. Because if this is the sort of source of the underlying economic instability that we have, and is ultimately what is preventing renewal, then, or some pathway out of economic malaise punctuated by severe crisis, which is pretty much what we've had since about 1997, then we are going to have to reimagine a kind of different version, let's say, of Keynesianism, where we're actually engaging with the realities of debt overhang, which I'll get to the punchline is debt relief. If anyone wants to ask me about that, I'll answer questions about that.
Great. Thank you.